Solve this, and I'll give you $155 million. The words were spoken lightly, almost playfully, but the entire penthouse went silent the moment they left Adrian Vale's mouth. Crystal chandeliers glowed above a room filled with Manhattan's most powerful investors, their laughter fading as a white linen napkin slid across the polished marble table. On it, a string of numbers, symbols, and a short challenge written in neat black ink. A puzzle that had already defeated hedge fund strategists, tech founders, and 2 professors from MIT earlier that evening. Adrian leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of sparkling water as if the offer meant nothing at all. For him, $155 million was simply another number in a world made entirely of numbers. But what he truly enjoyed was the moment right after the challenge. The pause, the uncomfortable silence, the subtle reminder that everyone in the room existed somewhere beneath him. Around the table, executives leaned closer, studying the napkin again, hoping someone else might suddenly see what they had missed before. No one spoke. The city stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows behind them, Manhattan glowing in 1,000 points of white light, taxis moving like streams of gold far below. Inside the room, however, the air had turned strangely still, and standing quietly beside the table, holding a silver tray against her black uniform, was Claire Bennett. Most people in the room had not even noticed her before that moment. She had been refilling glasses, clearing plates, moving through the dinner service with the quiet precision of someone trained not to exist in the foreground. Waitresses, after all, were part of the furniture in rooms like this. Useful, invisible, temporary. Claire lowered the tray slightly as the napkin stopped near the edge of the table. Her eyes moved over the symbols without hurry. Not curiosity, recognition. Just a few feet away, one of the investors chuckled under his breath. "That thing's been sitting there for an hour," he muttered. "If anyone here could solve it, they already would have." Adrian heard the comment and smiled faintly. That was exactly the point. The puzzle was never just about mathematics. It was about people, about watching brilliant minds grow quiet when the answer refused to appear, about seeing confidence dissolve into polite excuses and strategic silence. He checked his watch, a polished Swiss piece worth more than most people's yearly salary, then glanced back at the napkin as if already bored with the entire experiment. "Come on," he said calmly, tapping the table once with his finger. $155 million. Surely someone here likes money. A few people laughed again, though it sounded thinner now. Claire shifted the tray to one hand. Her other hand rested lightly on the table beside the napkin. No one noticed the moment her gaze sharpened. No one noticed how quickly the pattern unfolded in her mind. Numbers aligning. Assumptions collapsing. The entire structure of the puzzle resting on a single mistake hidden in plain sight. She reached for a pen. Someone across the table frowned slightly, confused why the waitress had touched anything at all. Adrian noticed the movement last. He lifted an eyebrow, more amused than annoyed, watching the quiet woman lean slightly forward over the napkin. Claire wrote only one line. Then she set the pen down. For a second, nothing happened. And then the first person to read it stopped breathing. The gray-haired professor did not speak at first. His fingers tightened around the napkin as though the paper had suddenly gained weight. The room waited, unsure whether he was confused or impressed. Then he read the line again. Slowly, carefully. His eyes widened behind thin silver glasses. That is not possible," he murmured, though the words did not sound like doubt. They sounded like realization. Across the table, 2 venture capitalists leaned forward. One of them gently took the napkin and scanned the single sentence Claire had written. The man blinked once, then twice. The color drained slightly from his face. "She did not solve the equation," he said quietly. "She rewrote the premise." A ripple moved through the room. People who had been relaxed a moment earlier now leaned closer, chairs shifting softly across polished hardwood. Claire had already lifted her tray again, her posture calm, as if nothing unusual had happened. She did not look at the faces around the table. She did not wait for applause or explanation. She simply stepped back the way a professional server always does after placing something down. But the napkin no longer belonged to the table. It belonged to the room now. Adrian Vale watched the movement of the paper from one hand to another. His expression remained composed, but the faint smile he had worn earlier had faded almost completely. A young analyst spoke next, his voice hesitant. "If that assumption is wrong," he said slowly, pointing at the line Claire had written. Then the entire pricing model collapses. The professor nodded once. Exactly. Everyone here was trying to solve the wrong question. The room went quiet again, but this silence felt different. It was not the silence of confusion anymore. It was the silence that appears when a hidden door suddenly becomes visible. Adrian leaned forward slightly, finally reaching for the napkin himself. He read the symbols, then the single correction written beneath them. The line was short, barely more than a sentence. Yet in that moment, he understood what the others had begun to realize. The puzzle had never required a complicated answer. It required someone brave enough to challenge the structure of the question itself. Adrian looked up slowly. His eyes moved across the room until they landed on Claire. She was already clearing another table several feet away, placing empty glasses onto her tray with quiet efficiency. No drama, no pride, just work. For the first time that evening, Adrian Vale felt something unfamiliar slip through the calm confidence that usually defined him. Curiosity, not irritation, not amusement. Curiosity. He stood from his chair. The subtle movement immediately captured the attention of everyone in the room. Adrian rarely stood during his own dinners unless something truly mattered. He walked toward Claire with measured steps, the napkin still in his hand. Several guests turned in their chairs to watch. Claire sensed the shift in the room before she saw him approach. She placed the last glass onto the tray and turned slightly. Adrian stopped a few feet away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city lights reflected softly across the glass walls behind them. Adrian held up the napkin between two fingers. You wrote this in less than 5 seconds, he said calmly. Claire looked at the paper once, then back at him. Her expression did not change. Yes, sir, she answered quietly. Adrian studied her face, searching for arrogance, excitement, or nervousness. There was none, only composure. Interesting, he said at last. Then he tilted his head slightly and asked the question that now hung over the entire penthouse. Tell me something, miss, who exactly taught you to? See a mistake that a room full of billion-dollar strategists completely missed. Claire did not answer immediately. The question hung quietly between them, suspended in the warm light of the penthouse like a note that refused to fade. Around the room, conversations had stopped entirely. People who normally spoke in confident tones now waited like students watching a classroom moment unfold. Claire balanced the tray gently against her hip and looked at Adrian Vale for the first time with direct attention rather than polite professionalism. No one taught me that specific mistake, she said calmly. I simply noticed the assumption behind the numbers. Adrian studied her expression. It was not defensive. It was not proud. It sounded like a simple statement of fact. Behind him, the gray-haired professor stepped a little closer, curiosity pulling him forward. Young lady, he said carefully. Do you understand what that correction implies for the model he was presenting tonight? Claire nodded once. Yes, sir. Then say it, the professor replied, his voice almost eager now. The room leaned closer again. Claire glanced at the napkin in Adrian's hand, then at the polished glass wall where the reflection of the dinner table shimmered faintly against the night skyline. The projection assumes a stable input variable that is actually unstable, she said. Her voice remained quiet but steady enough for the entire room to hear. If that variable shifts even 2%, the expected return does not grow. It collapses. A few guests exchanged looks. One man who had been confident earlier now rubbed his forehead slowly. Another investor quietly pulled out his phone, calculating something under the table. Adrian remained perfectly still. And you saw that instantly, he asked. Claire shrugged slightly. The structure made it visible. The professor let out a slow breath and shook his head in disbelief. Do you realize, he said, almost laughing now, that 3 research teams spent 6 weeks evaluating that exact structure? Claire's eyes softened slightly, but she did not smile. Sometimes distance helps, she replied. Adrian tilted his head again, studying her in a way that no one in the room had expected. For the first time that evening, the billionaire was no longer observing a puzzle. He was observing a person, the quiet waitress who had stepped into a room full of power and calmly moved the foundation of the conversation. Your name, Adrian, said. Claire adjusted the tray slightly in her hands. Claire Bennett, sir. Adrian repeated it under his breath as if testing the sound. Claire Bennett. The name meant nothing to the investors around him. Yet something in the way she carried herself made the moment feel larger than a simple introduction. Adrian looked again at the line she had written. One sentence. That was all it had taken to shift the balance of the evening. He turned the napkin slowly between his fingers. You realize, he said thoughtfully, that I offered $155 million to anyone who solved this. Claire's expression remained unchanged. Yes, sir. And you also realize, Adrian continued, his voice quieter now, that most people would have made a speech about it. Claire finally allowed the smallest hint of a smile. Most people are not holding a tray full of empty glasses. A few guests laughed softly, though the sound carried respect now instead of amusement. Adrian did not laugh. Instead, he looked around the room once more at the investors who had earlier treated the puzzle like a game. The atmosphere had changed completely. What had begun as entertainment had become something else entirely. Adrian turned back toward Claire. His voice dropped slightly, thoughtful rather than mocking. Tell me something, Miss Bennet, he said. If you can see flaws like this in 5 seconds, why are you working here? The question floated quietly through the penthouse, and for the first time that evening, Claire did not answer right away. Claire's silence lingered long enough for the room to feel it. The question Adrian Vale had asked sounded simple, yet everyone sensed it carried more weight than curiosity. Why would someone capable of dismantling a multi-million-dollar financial model in seconds be quietly serving water at a private dinner? Claire adjusted the tray slightly, the faint clink of glass against metal breaking the stillness. Her eyes moved briefly across the skyline beyond the window, where Manhattan stretched for miles in quiet light. Because I needed a job, she said at last. The answer was calm, almost ordinary, and that was exactly what made it unsettling. Adrian did not look convinced. Men like him had built entire empires on reading people, on noticing the hesitation between words, the tension behind calm voices. Yet Claire Bennet stood there with the same steady composure she had shown since the moment she picked up the pen. You solved a structural error that teams of analysts missed, Adrian said slowly. People with degrees, data models, and entire departments behind them. Claire did not react to the comment. She simply lifted 2 empty glasses from the edge of the table and placed them carefully onto her tray. The motion was precise, almost mechanical, as if her body had memorized every step of the service routine. Degrees do not prevent assumptions, she said quietly. A few investors shifted in their seats. One of them nodded reluctantly. The professor who had first recognized her correction looked more intrigued than ever now. He stepped closer, studying Claire with growing interest. Miss Bennet, he said, where did you study? Claire paused for the smallest fraction of a second. The pause was subtle, but Adrian noticed it instantly. I studied mathematics for a while, she replied. The professor smiled slightly. Mathematics where? The room waited again. Claire did not look at him this time. Instead, she lifted the tray with both hands and began to step away from the table. Dinner service is not finished yet, she said politely. It was a graceful deflection, but Adrian Vale was not accustomed to unanswered questions. Claire, he said. Her name stopped her more effectively than any command. She turned back slowly. Adrian held the napkin between his fingers again. One line, he said thoughtfully, looking at the correction she had written. That single line changed the entire conversation tonight. He lifted his eyes toward her again. You say you studied mathematics for a while. That sounds like a very careful answer. Claire met his gaze calmly. The faint hum of the city beyond the windows filled the quiet space between them. Careful answers are usually the safest kind, she said. Adrian watched her for several seconds. The woman standing in front of him was unlike anyone he usually encountered. Most people in his world were eager to impress him, eager to display intelligence like a polished trophy. Claire Bennet did the opposite. She reduced everything to simplicity and stepped back from attention as soon as it appeared. That made her far more interesting than the puzzle ever had been. Adrian finally placed the napkin on the table again. You never asked about the money, he said. Claire tilted her head slightly. Which money? The $155 million I offered. For the first time since the evening began, a hint of warmth reached her eyes. I assumed that offer was part of the entertainment, she replied. The room grew quiet again, because everyone understood what she had just done. She had stepped out of the role Adrian had created. She had refused to play the game entirely. Adrian slowly exhaled, and something close to a smile touched the corner of his mouth. Not amusement. Respect. Interesting, he murmured. Then he looked around the room filled with investors and analysts who had been silent witnesses to the entire exchange. It seems, Adrian said calmly, that tonight's most valuable insight did not come from the people I invited. He turned back toward Claire. It came from the person no one thought to ask. Claire did not respond. She simply balanced the tray again and prepared to return to her work. But Adrian Vale had already decided something in that moment. The puzzle had ended. The real question had just begun. Claire moved away from the table with the same quiet rhythm she had carried all evening. The tray balanced easily in her hands, as if nothing important had happened. Yet the air in the penthouse had changed. Conversations did not return to their earlier confidence. Glasses remained half-lifted. Investors who normally spoke with certainty now watched the waitress moving between tables as if she had become the most interesting person in the room. Adrian Vale remained standing for a moment longer, studying the napkin resting on the polished marble surface. The single line Claire had written looked almost too simple to matter. Yet everyone present knew it had quietly dismantled an entire investment strategy that had been discussed for months. Adrian finally sat down again, though his attention no longer belonged to the presentation documents in front of him. Across the room, Claire set the tray down on a service cart and began arranging fresh glasses for the next round of drinks. Her movements were efficient, careful, almost meditative. There was no sign she expected the room to continue thinking about her. To Claire, the evening had simply continued. But Adrian Vale was not accustomed to unanswered questions. He turned slightly toward the gray-haired professor, who still held a thoughtful expression. You recognized her correction immediately, Adrian said quietly. The professor nodded once. Because it was elegant, he replied. And elegance in mathematics usually comes from experience. Adrian rested his fingers lightly on the table. You believe she has formal training. The professor let out a soft breath. I would say more than training. The way she approached the problem was not random. She saw the structure first and the numbers second. Adrian glanced again toward the service cart, where Claire now polished a glass with a folded white cloth. Interesting, he murmured. At the far end of the table, one of the younger investors finally spoke again. Even if she noticed the flaw, he said carefully, that does not necessarily mean she understands the full market implications. Adrian looked at him slowly. The room sensed the shift in tone immediately. Then perhaps, Adrian said calmly, we should test that assumption as well. The investor fell silent. Adrian stood once more and walked toward the service cart where Claire was finishing her task. She noticed him approach, but did not stop working. The cloth moved slowly around the rim of the glass until it shone under the warm lights. Adrian placed both hands lightly on the edge of the cart. Miss Bennett, he said. Claire set the glass down gently and looked at him. Yes, sir. Adrian did not speak for a moment. Instead, he studied her the same way he would study a new investment opportunity, searching for signals others might miss. Earlier you said the projection would collapse if that variable shifted 2%, he said. Claire nodded slightly. Yes. Adrian tilted his head. 2% is very specific. Claire's eyes remained calm. Because the sensitivity curve becomes unstable at that threshold. Adrian watched her carefully. There was no hesitation, no sign of guesswork. The explanation had come naturally, the way an experienced analyst might speak during a boardroom briefing. Behind Adrian, several guests had quietly moved closer again, listening. The professor's expression grew even more fascinated. Adrian leaned slightly closer to the service cart. If that model collapses, he continued, then the acquisition I was considering tonight becomes extremely risky. Claire did not react dramatically. She simply folded the cloth once and placed it beside the glasses. Yes, sir, she said softly. The simplicity of the answer echoed through the room. Adrian slowly straightened. Then allow me to ask you a different question, he said. Claire waited. Adrian's voice lowered slightly, thoughtful, rather than challenging. If you were sitting in my chair tonight, would you sign that deal? The room held its breath again, because everyone understood the weight behind that question. The question settled over the penthouse like a weight that no one in the room wanted to move. If you were sitting in my chair tonight, would you sign that deal? Claire Bennett did not answer immediately. She rested her hands lightly on the edge of the service cart, the polished glasses reflecting the warm chandelier light above. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan continued its endless motion, yellow taxis sliding through avenues like quiet streams of light. But inside the room, every conversation had stopped. Adrian Vale watched her closely. He had asked thousands of questions in boardrooms across the world, questions that could shift the direction of companies worth billions of dollars. Most people answered him quickly, sometimes too quickly. Claire Bennett was different. She allowed the silence to breathe before she spoke. "No, sir," she said calmly. The word landed softly, yet it echoed across the room more clearly than a raised voice ever could. One of the investors near the table shifted in his chair. Another leaned forward, waiting for her to explain. Adrian did not move. "And why not?" he asked quietly. Claire lifted one of the glasses from the cart and placed it carefully beside the others, aligning the rim with deliberate precision. Only then did she look back at him. "Because the error we discussed is only the first signal," she said. Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly with interest. "Go on." Claire nodded once toward the table behind him where the documents and tablets still displayed the financial projections for the proposed acquisition. "The model assumes stability not only in the pricing variable," she continued, "but also in the supply response over the next 12 months. A few people at the table exchanged looks. The professor folded his arms slowly, listening with growing curiosity. Claire's voice remained quiet but steady. "However, if the market reacts the way your projections expect, the supplier side will adjust much faster than the model allows for. That means margins compress before the acquisition reaches its intended scale." One of the analysts quietly opened a spreadsheet on his tablet and began recalculating. His fingers paused halfway through the process. "She might be right," he whispered to the person beside him. Adrian heard it. His attention remained fixed on Claire. "You are suggesting the reaction curve is steeper than the projections show," he said. Claire nodded again. "Yes, sir." "By how much?" Claire considered for a moment, then answered without hesitation. "Approximately 4 to 5% within the first 2 quarters." The professor exhaled slowly. That would erase nearly half the projected upside. The room absorbed the statement in silence. Adrian turned slightly, glancing at the screens across the table. The numbers he had reviewed earlier now appeared less certain than they had an hour before. Then he looked back at Claire. She had already begun placing the polished glasses onto the tray again, as if her role in the conversation had ended the moment she answered the question. Adrian rested one hand lightly against the service cart. "Miss Bennett," he said. She paused and looked up again. "Yes, sir." Adrian studied her for several seconds, his expression thoughtful rather than skeptical. "You are analyzing a multi-billion-dollar acquisition while holding a tray of water glasses," he said quietly. Claire did not smile this time. "The numbers do not change based on where someone is standing," she replied. A faint murmur of agreement moved through the room. Adrian straightened slowly, the smallest hint of admiration crossing his face. For years he had surrounded himself with experts, consultants, and advisors who spoke in confident presentations filled with polished language. Yet the clearest insight of the evening had come from a woman who had not even been invited to sit at the table. Adrian picked up the napkin again and looked at the line she had written earlier. Then he glanced toward the skyline outside the glass walls, thinking. When he turned back to her, his voice carried a new tone. Not amusement, not challenge, something closer to respect. "Tell me one more thing, Claire," he said quietly. "If the deal is that unstable, why do you think my analysts failed to see it?" Claire did not answer Adrian Vale's question right away. The room remained completely still, as if every person present understood that the next few words might carry more weight than the entire presentation earlier that evening. Claire lifted the tray again, adjusting the balance of the glasses with the quiet precision she had used all night. Then she looked at Adrian calmly. "Because they were solving the question they were given," she said. Adrian watched her carefully. "And that is a problem." Claire nodded slightly. "Most people assume the structure of a problem is correct. They focus on the solution, not the foundation." Across the room, the professor slowly smiled, the expression of someone recognizing a familiar kind of thinking. "That is true," he said softly. Claire continued, her voice steady enough for everyone to hear. "When people are surrounded by experts, they begin trusting the framework more than their own observation. If the model looks sophisticated, it feels safe to assume the logic behind it has already been verified." One of the investors shifted in his chair, glancing at the screens again. The spreadsheets and graphs that had looked impressive an hour ago now seemed less certain. Adrian folded his arms slightly, listening without interruption. Claire rested the tray against the service cart once more. There is another reason, she added. Adrian lifted an eyebrow. Which is? Claire's eyes moved briefly toward the table where the acquisition proposal still glowed on a tablet screen. Because success can create pressure to confirm expectations, she said quietly. The words landed gently but clearly. A few people exchanged uneasy looks. Adrian remained expressionless, though the observation was not lost on him. Claire continued, if everyone expects the deal to work, the analysis often searches for confirmation rather than contradiction. The more time and resources invested in the idea, the harder it becomes to question it. The professor gave a thoughtful nod. Confirmation bias, he murmured. Claire acknowledged the comment with a small glance in his direction. Adrian studied her again, this time more slowly. So you believe my analysts did not see the flaw because they wanted the deal to succeed? Claire answered carefully. I believe they trusted the structure they were given. Adrian let the words settle. Around them, the city lights reflected across the glass walls like distant constellations. The penthouse, filled with wealth and reputation, had grown quiet in a way none of the guests had expected when the dinner began. Adrian finally spoke again. You speak as if you have seen this happen before. Claire's expression remained neutral. It happens often. In investment analysis, Adrian asked. Claire paused for a moment. Then she answered with simple honesty. In any system where people become confident too quickly. A faint smile appeared on the professor's face. Adrian noticed it. You seem impressed, Adrian said. The professor chuckled softly. I am reminded of something one of my best graduate students once said, he replied. Adrian tilted his head slightly. Which was? The professor looked toward Claire for a brief moment before answering. He said that the most dangerous assumption in mathematics is the one everyone stops questioning. The room absorbed the statement in thoughtful silence. Adrian turned his attention back to Claire Bennett, the waitress who had quietly stepped into a conversation meant for billion-dollar strategists and shifted the direction of the entire evening. Adrian reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small card. He placed it gently on the service cart beside the folded cloth. Claire Bennett, he said calmly. I have spent years paying consultants extraordinary amounts of money to challenge my thinking. Claire glanced briefly at the card but did not pick it up yet. Adrian continued. Tonight you did it without even sitting at the table. He rested his hand lightly against the card, his voice steady but sincere. Which makes me curious about something. Claire looked at him again. Adrian's expression held genuine interest now. What exactly happened, he asked quietly, that convinced someone like you that carrying a tray was a better use of your mind than sitting in a boardroom? Claire looked at the card resting on the service card, but did not touch it. The small rectangle of polished paper carried Adrian Vale's name in sharp black letters, the kind of card that usually opened doors before conversations even began. For a moment, she simply watched the reflection of the chandelier lights glimmer across its surface. Around the room, the investors waited quietly. They had come to the dinner expecting negotiations, projections, and confident predictions about the future of a billion-dollar acquisition. Instead, they found themselves watching a quiet conversation between the most powerful man in the room and the person who had originally been invisible to them. Claire lifted the tray again, placing 2 empty glasses onto it before answering. Nothing convinced me that carrying a tray was a better use of my mind, she said calmly. Adrian remained still, listening. Then why? He asked softly. Claire looked toward the skyline beyond the glass walls. The city stretched endlessly under the night sky, thousands of windows glowing like distant signals. Because sometimes, life chooses timing instead of talent, she said. A few people in the room leaned closer, sensing the shift in her tone. Claire continued, her voice steady but quieter now. 3 years ago, I was studying applied mathematics at Columbia University. The professor's eyebrows rose immediately. Adrian's attention sharpened. Full scholarship, Claire added simply. The professor let out a faint breath of recognition. That program is extremely selective, he said. Claire nodded once. Yes, sir. Adrian watched her carefully. And you left. Claire did not hesitate. My mother became ill, she said. The words were simple, but the meaning behind them settled into the room with quiet weight. Medical treatment is expensive, she continued. Research grants do not cover hospital bills. The investors exchanged subtle glances. For many of them, the cost of healthcare had never been something that forced life-altering decisions. Claire placed another glass onto the tray and aligned it with the others. I worked 2 jobs while trying to finish my courses, she said. Eventually, the hours stopped fitting inside the same day. Adrian's voice softened slightly. So you stepped away from the program? Claire nodded. For now. The professor studied her with deep interest. Your professors must have tried to convince you to stay. Claire allowed the smallest hint of a smile. They did. And yet you left anyway, Adrian said. Claire looked at him again. There are moments when equations become less important than people, she replied quietly. The room absorbed the statement without a sound. Adrian glanced once more at the business card resting on the cart. Then he looked back at her. You never returned to the program. Claire shook her head slightly. Not yet. Adrian rested his hand on the edge of the service card, his expression thoughtful. The woman standing in front of him had quietly dismantled a financial model that entire consulting teams had approved, yet she spoke about her own ability as if it were an ordinary skill. You understand, Adrian said slowly, that the insight you offered tonight may have just saved me from making a very expensive mistake. Claire answered simply. Then I am glad the question was asked. Adrian watched her for several seconds, then gently pushed the card a little closer toward her. Claire Bennett, he said calmly. People spend years searching for advisors who are willing to challenge them honestly. Claire glanced again at the card but still did not pick it up. Adrian continued. You did it while clearing glasses. The faintest smile returned to Claire's expression. Sometimes the best place to observe a system, she said softly, is from the edge of the room. Adrian considered the thought carefully. The investors around them remained silent, aware they were witnessing something more significant than a simple conversation. Adrian finally straightened and spoke again, his voice calm but deliberate. Then perhaps it is time, he said, for someone who sees from the edge of the room to finally sit at the table. Claire Bennett did not pick up the card right away. The words Adrian Vale had spoken hung quietly in the warm air of the penthouse. For a moment the room seemed to pause between 2 different versions of the evening. One version was the dinner everyone expected, where powerful investors congratulated themselves on confident projections and billion-dollar opportunities. The other version had arrived unexpectedly, carried in the calm voice of a waitress who had quietly shifted the direction of the conversation. Claire finally lifted the card from the service card and studied it for a second. The lettering was simple and sharp. Adrian Vale, Founder and Chief Executive Officer. Vale Strategic Holdings. She turned the card gently between her fingers as if weighing something invisible. Adrian watched her without impatience. The investors around the room remained silent, aware that whatever happened next would matter more than the puzzle that had started the evening. Claire placed the card carefully into the pocket of her apron. Thank you, she said softly. Adrian tilted his head slightly. That sounds like acceptance. Claire shook her head once. That sounds like consideration. A few people in the room smiled quietly. Adrian did not seem offended. If anything, the answer seemed to interest him even more. Fair enough, he replied. Consideration is rare in a world that prefers immediate decisions. Claire lifted the tray again and gathered the last empty glasses from the nearby table. The soft clink of glass echoed through the quiet room. You offered $155 million earlier tonight, she said calmly. Adrian nodded. I did. Claire looked at him directly. But the value of a good question is usually higher than the value of a quick answer. The professor chuckled softly behind them. Adrian allowed the faintest smile to appear. You believe the real question tonight was not the puzzle. Claire shook her head gently. No, sir. Then what was it? Adrian asked. Claire glanced around the penthouse once more. Investors, analysts, and advisors were all watching her now with a different kind of attention than they had shown earlier. The real question, she said quietly, was whether anyone in this room was still willing to challenge their own assumptions. The words settled into the silence like a final note at the end of a piece of music. Adrian slowly exhaled, looking across the city lights beyond the glass walls. For years he had built companies, negotiated deals, and surrounded himself with experts who were paid to provide answers. Yet the most valuable insight of the night had arrived from someone who had not been invited to the table at all. He turned back toward Claire. If you decide to call, he said calmly, I will answer. Claire nodded once. I believe that. Adrian picked up the napkin from the table one last time and folded it carefully before placing it inside his jacket pocket. The simple line written on it had already changed the outcome of the evening. As Claire began walking toward the service hallway with the tray balanced steadily in her hands, the investors watched her with new understanding. She had entered the room as someone invisible. She left it as the person everyone would remember. And somewhere in the quiet space between those two moments, the most powerful lesson of the night had appeared without raising its voice. Never assume that the person standing quietly at the edge of the room is not the one who understands the system best.